Good morning, disciples, apostles, and saints. Welcome to St. Stephen's. We gather here to help one another grow in love for neighbor, self, creation, and God. We're here in love, and we're glad you're here. Now, this time we're gathering here together is for a short reflection on the scripture reading for Sunday. Now, we'll also be doing a deeper dive into the reading specifically on Tuesday night on Zoom. Check out our website for more information about that. But what we'll be doing here is to sort of help us get a sense of the story, get a little bit of what's happening in the bigger picture, and to help us keep up with what is happening in the narrative, right? So our basic story so far that we're getting to here in the second half of Mark 7 is that when we picked it up way back at the beginning of this gospel, toward the beginning, Jesus called a bunch of disciples to follow him. He started healing people and doing all sorts of crazy stuff. And then he gave them his power to heal and to exorcise demons, right? And they go out and they do it. And so one of the main themes that we have been exploring throughout Mark up to this point is the frightening power of Jesus. Because one of the things that has happened multiple times throughout this is that Jesus has done things that has scared his followers because they are beyond what a normal healer would be able to do. So there's a big piece of this that is Jesus has more power than they can imagine or that they are comfortable with acknowledging. A second theme is the disciples' participation in that power. It's something that is often in the background of these stories, but it is an essential element because Jesus is bringing the disciples along and encouraging them to be apostles, right? So they are learning and then they're doing. And so there's this ongoing tension for us as the reader because we're seeing and focusing on Jesus. But in the background, there's this other piece with these followers who also have a connection to the power that Jesus has a connection to as well. Then a third thing, and it's one that we haven't talked about yet, but we'll talk about this morning, is keeping quiet. Jesus keeps going at this idea of the people who experience these miracles needing to not talk about it. So that's going to come up in today's reading. Today we're reading from the gospel that we know as Mark, chapter 7, verses 24 to 37. So it comes right after last week's, which ended at 23. But here we go. From there he set out and went away to the region of Tyre. He entered a house and did not want anyone to know he was there, yet he could not escape notice. But a woman whose little daughter had an unclean spirit immediately heard about him, and she came and bowed down at his feet. Now the woman was a Gentile of Syrophoenician origin. She begged him to cast the demon out of her daughter. He said to her, "Let the children be fed first, for it is not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs." But she answered him, "Sir, even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs." Then he said to her, "For saying that, you may go. The demon has left your daughter." So she went home, found the child lying in the bed, and the demon gone. Then he returned from the region of Tyre and went by way of Sidon towards the Sea of Galilee in the region of the Decapolis. They brought to him a deaf man who had an impediment in his speech, and they begged him to lay his hand on him. He took him aside in private, away from the crowd, and put his fingers into his ears, and he spat and touched his tongue. Then looking up to heaven, he sighed and said to him, "Ephphatha," that is, "be opened." And immediately his ears were opened, his tongue was released, and he spoke plainly. Then Jesus ordered them to tell no one, but the more he ordered them, the more zealously they proclaimed it. They were astounded beyond measure, saying, "He has done everything well. He even makes the deaf to hear and the mute to speak." So it's this story that we just heard has two healings, and there's a sense in which they're both very different and yet perhaps connected in a way. And one of the things that that I recognize as we're doing this is that sometimes we don't. There's a way in which these two healings at this stage, when Jesus has already done really more profound things than this. It senses this sort of like walking on water, stilling a storm, feeding 5,000 people. Those things seem to upstage these two, in a sense. So there's a way that I think we might not hear the potency that's here, or get a sense of what's happening if we just were sort of like comparing them all. As if these things are better than, if one thing's better than the other. So that's one thing that just sort of makes me think about, that I'm thinking about while I'm reading this. Now, looking at that first one, there's this woman who comes to Jesus, and there's a sense in here, I think the sort of easy response to the story is that Jesus is like, nah, I don't really, I don't feel the need to heal her. And she convinces him. And he says, she's healed because of your faith. So there's a way in which there's a thing about persistence here that's very common. That's a very common response. And it fits with the way Jesus talks particularly in Matthew, about persistence. So there's a sense here in which perhaps this is a story about persistence. But it also has this other dynamic, which is more, it's a question that I have that I don't have a good answer to, but it's one that may come to mind as you're reading it or hearing it, which is, why doesn't Jesus heal this girl? Like, why doesn't he want to heal her straight up? Or why does he feel the need to sort of like test or push or whatever? There's some sort of thing happening here. And one of those pieces, and it's, we'll go into perhaps a little more detail on Tuesday, but part of the deal is that this is, it says that Syrophoenician, she is not, within the Hebrew family, immediate family. So she is an outsider. And so in this, there is this push and pull. So here is someone coming from outside the circle, asking for something. Jesus seems to compare her to a dog, right? Which, depending on how you want to take it, there's the best version of that story is that Jesus does not mean to directly insult her. That's the best version. The worst version is that he actually compares her to a dog, or that he is belittling her because she's from a different nationality, right? And so she compels him. So there does seem to be an interesting dynamic here. And it is one worth looking at, that perhaps there's a sort of a crossing of a boundary, and that Jesus himself is persuaded. I think there's a way in which I think the thing that we might want to look at a little bit more deeply is what it looks like to have a vision of Jesus in which Jesus can be persuaded. I think that's a bit more fascinating. There's also, you cannot hide the fact that Jesus is demonstrating an incredible power here that is unique and different from what we've seen before, which is the idea of healing from a great distance without seeing the person, knowing the person, or anything. So there was an earlier thing, a couple chapters ago, in which a woman was tugging on Jesus's cloak and is healed by touching his clothes. And what's profound about that moment, right, is that Jesus notices the power leaving his body, right? And it has this sort of sensation of Jesus's influence in the world. It goes beyond the anticipated. And the anticipated is that he has to physically be in the room with a person, touching a person, right? So, and so here was one in which he didn't touch the person and will his spirit into them. That person just touched his clothes and somehow got healed. Well, here, this girl is healed. Who knows the distance? Who knows where she is? Jesus doesn't, there's a sort of sense in which we might think that Jesus needs a GPS signal tracker on the girl to know the right one, right? The right location. And then there's this other way in which we sort of skip over the potency of that and be like, yeah, of course he'd know, right? Yeah, he knows everything. Well, when you get to that sort of level, it sort of dismisses just how profound it is to suggest that here's this guy that she would meet, and he somehow is able to heal her daughter without knowing where she lives, right? Without knowing where that daughter is. She's just healed. So there's a way in which that is way too big a deal to just sweep under the rug or to get obsessed about some of this other minutia. That's the bigger story. But it's not one I've ever heard on a Sunday morning considered as the big story. Then we have, following this incredible thing in which Jesus can heal someone without knowing where they are, you then have this is sort of put next to, it butts up to another healing. And this one, in some ways, is the sort of the mirror image, the sort of opposite version, where here's a person this is a healing that is incredibly physical, right? So as opposed to the big distance and the unknowing of where things are, here he is sticking his fingers in the ears and spitting on the tongue. It is so graphic and physical and present that these two are juxtaposed against each other, and yet both of them demonstrate Jesus' healing, right? So you're given these images that are so different from each other, and yet we take them together. So here's this way out here, and here's Jesus right up in this person's face, right? So there's that physicality. It's also interesting that both of these healings are not happening in crowds. So here's this woman, this girl is healed in her own home without anyone being there. It's like the girl that was raised, the daughter that was raised from the dead in her own home, and no one else was there except a couple of disciples and the parents and Jesus, and that's it, right? That was just a couple chapters ago. Now we have a similar case in which this girl is being healed in her own home at a great distance away. Here, this man is being healed, separated from the people. So Jesus takes and they go away. So it's not so there's clearly these images of Jesus not showing off the extreme power of these sort of extreme powers of healing in front of everybody. These are actually very intentionally intimate moments. So it sort of contrasts with what you had, one of the themes I didn't mention at the beginning, but one of the big this contrasts with what was happening in chapters 4 and 5, when the people were pushing in and demanding so much of Jesus. It was becoming physically dangerous to be around him. There were all of these people coming to him for healing. And so there's a sense that this contrasts just how public that was, how public it was that all of these people were coming and getting healed and bringing their people to him, and the lines and the crowds and the mobs that were forming. So here's a contrast, this intimate settings of individuals and families to be able to participate in this. Now, it also creates a dynamic about these healings that means that they're not observable themselves. The healing is itself not observable, but the outcome is, right? And I think that's a potent image for us to hold on to and not overlook. That in part because what we have just spent a lot of time talking about over the last 5 or 6 or 7 weeks is just how significant it is that what Jesus is doing, what Jesus is sort of, the whole purpose of this is that Jesus is getting us not to focus on the sign itself, not to turn the sign into an idol, right? And put our attention and focus onto the idol and miss what it means, right? So there's a sense here of that this idea of the outcomes being public. So in each of these, Jesus does send the healed person back into the community as a testimony, right? But it's not the healing in itself. It is the observation of the person who is healed and transformed and able to resume their full status in the community, right? That's what they get to observe, right? So that's a huge part of the gospel, and one that I think we ought to hold up and recognize is happening here. So, and this brings me to the sort of the last piece, which is the sort of the traditional idea of the messianic secret, which is something throughout the Gospel of Mark. Jesus is constantly saying, "Don't tell anybody about this. Don't tell anybody. Don't tell anybody about this." Or "Don't tell anybody until I'm dead." Right? It just sort of has this. It has this. Don't tell anybody. And what it says, throughout the gospel, whenever he says, "Don't tell anybody about this," then they turn around and tell everybody about it. In terms of the story, it gives us an interesting tension. But I think just in the same way that we don't get, the public isn't seeing these things, but they see the outcomes of it. I think there's this wonderful contrast between what Jesus is asking of them to do and but that they are incapable of doing it. And often, when we look at that, it's Jesus, in my mind, I think of the disciples. Jesus tells the disciples to do something and they just can't do it. So it's sort of a failure on their part because Jesus is trying to get them to be better, and they keep failing at it. I think this may be, there's a way in which this is like that, but I think it may also be different, and it recasts how I see the disciples too, in the same way. That Jesus is saying, don't tell other people about this, don't go telling the world about it. And yet they go and they do. It sort of shows just how excited they are, how transformative an experience it is that you need to tell people about being transformed. I think there is something really significant about that dynamic that is not a negative. I think that describes it in a way that we can appreciate. When you find something that's really good, or something has really moved you, or we will literally say, "This changed my life," right? When that's the case, do you not talk about it? No, of course you do. You tell everybody you can think of, or you find the people you need to tell. Some people who have a similar circumstance. So, if you find this, if you, it's why people who like vegans or CrossFit, or you sort of develop these things, you discover them and they transform your life, and you're like, oh my gosh, I know these people could really use this change in their life too, right? And so you want to tell them. I think that's a big part of this. I think there are all sorts of other things about that are worth exploring, but I think there's a big part of this has to do with the way Jesus is encouraging the people to see it. For me, I want to hearken back to a very specific example of this, which you can find in Mark 5. It's the one in which Jesus heals a man who is living in a cemetery, and he is overwhelmed by demons, many, many demons, who goes by the name of Legion, right? And what happens at the end of that story is, here is this man who has just been freed. His humanity is restored, and he wants to follow Jesus. He wants to follow the man who saved him. A very natural response. And Jesus's response is, on the surface, curious and confusing, but it makes total sense when we think about, if we start to imagine what Jesus's actual motivation is. And he tells the man, no, you can't follow me. I need you to do something else. I need you to go home. Right? I need you to go home. Two things. One is, Jesus didn't heal the man of the demons because that itself is the purpose. It's not to say it isn't good, but it's not his sole purpose. His sole purpose is not to heal one dude, right, of one malady. It also isn't to collect people. He doesn't heal the guy in hopes that this guy will follow him, because the purpose is not following him entirely. The disciples follow him. They need to follow him so that they can learn how to do what he does. He has given this man a particular mission in the world, and that is to be the testimony, to be the witness with his body and with his mouth, right? And with his place in the community. He has been restored. Someone who is not allowed to be in the community has been restored to the community. So his work is to be in the community. Right? It's much like what happens when the wrongfully convicted are brought back into the world. They have a job to do to be restored to our community, and to help us see what it's like to lock someone away for 25 years. That shouldn't have been there, right? We need that, and he needs that. And we need to find a way to help all people be restored into their community. That is ultimately, I think, the ministry that Jesus is calling us into. Well, I'm so grateful that you can be with us today. You are a blessing. And may you continue to bless your community. So God's grace be with you. Christ's peace be with you. The Spirit's outpouring be with you, now and always. Amen.